It's 11 p.m. You should be sleeping. But you're not sleeping. You're lying there, staring at the ceiling, and somehow your brain, the same brain that struggled to answer an email this afternoon, has suddenly decided that now is the perfect time to become the most alone it's been all day. And the questions you've been successfully avoiding since breakfast are beginning to reappear, one by one. Why does this happen? Why does it feel like a completely different person lives inside your head at night? Because according to a growing body of research, your nighttime brain is not simply your daytime brain with less energy. It operates under a different set of rules, and that change has a strange consequence. The same shift that can make you more reflective, more imaginative, and sometimes even more creative after dark, may also make your worst thoughts feel more convincing. In fact, some researchers now believe that the brain awake after midnight may be one of the least reliable versions of itself. Not because it's broken, not because you're anxious, not because something is wrong with you, but because after midnight, the systems that help you keep perspective begin to change. And once you understand what's actually happening inside your brain during those late-night hours, you'll never look at your 2 a.m. thoughts the same way again. Because the thoughts that find you in the dark are not random. They're not appearing out of nowhere. They're arriving for a reason. The question is whether they're telling you the truth, or whether your brain is telling a very different story after midnight. Think about who you are at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. You're functional. Someone asks how you're doing and you say, "I'm fine." And most of the time, you actually mean it. But something interesting is happening behind the scenes. All day long, your brain is acting like a filter, a gatekeeper. Thousands of thoughts try to get through every day. The relationship you're not sure about. The career path you've been quietly questioning. The fear that maybe you're not where you thought you'd be by now. Most of those thoughts never make it very far. Not because they're gone, because your brain has more urgent things to do. That can wait until later. And for most of the day, that system works remarkably well. The part of your brain responsible for focus, self-control, and decision-making helps keep everything organized, functional. But by evening, that mental gatekeeper begins to get tired. After a full day of decisions, conversations, distractions, responsibilities, and emotional management, maintaining that level of control becomes harder. And as the filter weakens, something unexpected happens. The thoughts that were waiting quietly in the background begin to move forward. The questions you postponed, the feelings you didn't have time to process, the things that felt avid to ignore when the world was loud. Suddenly, they're harder to avoid. This isn't a malfunction. It's not overthinking. And it's not your brain turning against you. It's what happens when the noise of the day finally begins to fade. Because when the world gets quieter, your inner world gets louder. But here's the catch. The same change that makes the mind more open to creativity can also make it more vulnerable. And this is where the night stops being interesting and starts becoming harder to trust. Have you ever noticed how a problem that seems manageable at 2 p.m. can feel overwhelming at 2 a.m.? A relationship suddenly feels doomed. A mistake feels unforgivable. An uncertain future starts looking like a disaster waiting to happen. Nothing actually changed. Your life is the same. Your circumstances are the same. The only thing that's different is the brain that's looking at them. Researchers call this phenomenon the mind after midnight. And according to this growing body of research, when you're awake deep into the night, your brain begins to process information differently, not slightly differently, differently enough to change how we see ourselves, other people, and the future. As the night goes on, the systems involved in emotional regulation begin to lose some of their influence. At the same time, the brain becomes more sensitive to negative information. The world outside hasn't changed, but your ability to see it clearly has. That's what many researchers believe is happening after midnight. The brain becomes increasingly biased toward what's wrong, what's uncertain, and what could go badly. The problem is that protection and accuracy are not the same thing. A brain focused on potential threats isn't looking for balance, it's looking for danger. Which is why the thoughts that arrive after midnight often feel so convincing. Not because they're necessarily true, but because the part of the brain responsible for perspective is no longer operating at full strength. Suddenly, a temporary fear starts sounding like a permanent truth. A passing doubt becomes a conclusion. A difficult moment becomes evidence that everything is falling apart. But here's the most important thing to understand. The night didn't create those fears. The night amplified them. And there is a difference, because what feels like clarity at 2 a.m. is often something else entirely. It's exhaustion wearing the mask of certainty. So if the night amplifies what's already there, why do the biggest questions seem to appear after dark? Why is it always at night that you suddenly start thinking about the relationship you're uncertain about? The career path you've been second-guessing? The conversation you can't stop replaying? Why does it always seem to happen when the lights go out? Because during the day, your attention belongs to the outside world. The world keeps handing your brain new things to focus on. And for most of the day, that's enough to keep deeper questions waiting their turn. But eventually, the world gets quiet. The notifications stop. The conversations end. The distractions disappear. And for the first time all day, your attention has nowhere left to go except inward. This is when the mind begins doing a different kind of work, processing. It starts revisiting unfinished experiences, unanswered questions, emotions that never received your full attention. And that's why the same thoughts often return again and again. Not because your mind is broken, not because you're obsessing, but because something inside you still considers them unfinished. The relationship that doesn't feel quite right. The grief you never fully processed. The decision you're afraid to make. The version of yourself you secretly miss. During the day, those thoughts sit quietly in the background. At night, they finally get a chance to speak. And that's what makes nighttime thinking so confusing. Because some of those thoughts are important. Some of them deserve your attention. Some of them are pointing toward real problems that need to be faced. The challenge is learning the difference between a message and a distortion, between a truth you've been avoiding and a fear your exhausted brain has magnified. Because the night doesn't just bring thoughts to the surface, it mixes insight and illusion together. And sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. And this is where things become uncomfortable. Because by now, you might be wondering if your nighttime brain is more vulnerable to fear, and if your nighttime thoughts aren't always reliable, then shouldn't I just ignore them? The answer is no. And that's what makes this so complicated, because the thoughts themselves are often pointing towards something real. Those things didn't appear because it was midnight. They were already there. The night simply made them harder to ignore. The uncomfortable truth is that it's easy to spend your days outrunning questions you don't want to face. And then later arrives, usually sometime after midnight. The problem isn't that the questions are false. The problem is that the answers you reach at 2 a.m. often are. That's the distinction that matters. The question may be real. The fear may be real. The uncertainty may be real. But the conclusion is often being written by an exhausted brain. But certainty is not the same thing as truth. And the nighttime brain is often very good at producing certainty. So the goal isn't to silence those thoughts. And it isn't to blindly believe them either. It's to listen carefully enough to hear the message, without automatically accepting the verdict. Because sometimes the night is showing you a problem that deserves your attention. And sometimes it's showing you that same problem through a lens of fear. The wisdom comes from learning the difference. So what do you do with all of this? What do you do with a mind that becomes both more insightful and more vulnerable after dark? The first step is surprisingly simple. Don't treat every nighttime thought as a revelation. When an important thought appears after midnight, don't rush to solve it. Don't rush to believe it either. Just notice it. Let it exist. The goal is to understand what it's trying to tell you. Then come back to it in daylight, when emotion and reason are working together again. If the thought still matters in the morning, it probably deserves your attention. If it disappears with the sunrise, it may have belonged more to exhaustion than reality. There is something strange about the world after midnight, not because the world changes, because our relationship to it changes. And what's left is the conversation you've been postponing. That's why the night can feel so uncomfortable, but it's also why it can feel so honest. Because beneath the worries, beneath the distortions, and beneath the fears amplified by exhaustion, there is often something real trying to get your attention. The mistake isn't having nighttime thoughts. The mistake is assuming they are either completely true or completely false. So the next time you find yourself awake after midnight, staring at the ceiling while your mind refuses to be quiet, remember this: you don't have to believe every thought. You don't have to fight every thought either. Just listen, then wait for the morning. Because the thoughts that find you after midnight were never waiting in the dark. They were following you all day. The night simply made the room quiet enough for them to speak.
And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on my future uploads. See you there.